Thank you for joining us on our journey through Vietnam. Carol and I thoroughly enjoyed our visit and found this a fascinating country. I am very impressed by these brave and energetic people who endured a major war but rebuilt the country into a thriving economic powerhouse. But as is often the case in these ancient civilizations, there is so much more to talk about than one can cover in 1 hour. As you know, the country is situated in Southeast Asia, bordered by China in the north, Laos and Cambodia on the west. Now for some statistics. The population is 96 million at present. It's a long sliver of the country, 1,650 kilometers long. In fact, it always reminds me of Italy. It's about a quarter of the size of South Africa. Religion has played an important part in its history. As you can see from those figures, it's divided amongst folk religions, Buddhists and Christians. This is the flag of the country, which reminds us that it is a communist-controlled state. For convenience and clarity, I have subdivided the history of the country into 4 periods. The founding Dai Viet period, running up to 1802. The imperial period, from 1802 to 1945, when the French reoccupied Vietnam after the Second World War and the last emperor abdicated. The French colonial period, from 1859 to 1940, when the Japanese invaded Vietnam during the Second World War. And the War and Unification period after the Second World War until 1975, with the final collapse of the South Vietnamese government. The oldest is the Dai Viet period, approximately in the year 1000 AD, an indigenous Viet tribe centered around the Red River in the northern part of Vietnam obtained autonomy from the Chinese rulers. In the year 1010, they moved their capital to Hanoi. Then followed the imperial period. From the 1620s onwards, due to migration, the southern part of the coastal area became increasingly Vietnamese, especially around the Mekong Delta. The city of Saigon was already founded in 1698. In 1802, the Vietnamese ruler of the time decided to move his capital further south in order to be closer to the burgeoning Vietnamese population along the coast. Following some kind of vision that he had about the future greatness of the country, decided to move the capital southwards to the city of Hue, and in 1832 he annexed the southern part of the country. Hue became the imperial capital, and all the court manners and many of the traditions in Vietnam were developed during that period. The colonial period ran in parallel with the imperial period, with the French first occupying the southern Mekong Delta area, which was incorporated into a protectorate called Cochin China. Hanoi was first captured in 1873, and the northern Dai Viet area incorporated into a protectorate known as Tonkin. In 1887, France created Indochina, which included Laos and Cambodia. Vietnam was effectively separated into 3 areas known as Tonkin, Annam, and Cochin China. Hanoi was the capital of all of Indochina. That lasted until the outbreak of the Second World War, when Japan occupied Vietnam. After the defeat of Japan at the end of the Second World War, France resumed control of the country in 1945. That initiated the 4th period of war and eventual unification. The Vietnamese demanded independence during the peace negotiations at the end of the Second World War. When this did not happen, Ho Chi Minh started the war against the French occupation with the so-called Viet Minh forces, resulting in the defeat of France in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu. The country was then divided between a communist-led north under Ho Chi Minh and a capitalist south under President Ngo Dien Diem. The border was established at the infamous 17th parallel, with a 5-kilometer demilitarized zone, or DMZ as Americans would call it, on either side of the border. The Great Vietnam or American War ensued between North and South, resulting in the fall of Saigon in 1975. The country has been united under a communist regime since 1976. I think it is important to recognize from its history that the Vietnamese are a fiercely independent people, and that their communist ideology is not simply an extension of the Russian or the Chinese ideology. And this was a fallacy of American foreign policy because they became trapped in a war without recognizing that it was fundamentally a war to reunite the country and not the extension of communism into the whole of Southeast Asia. They were trapped because the domino theory of the time, as first articulated by President Eisenhower, held if Vietnam were to go communist, all the other countries of Southeast Asia would also automatically follow suit. They were trapped in this terrible conflict for many, many years. We will talk a little bit more about it as the presentation continues. We will start our visit in Hanoi. On the road from the airport into town, we pass this iconic cantilever bridge across the Red River. It was heavily bombarded during the war years due to its critical position, being the only bridge at that time across the Red River that connected Hanoi to its main port city of Haifang. The bridge continues to play a large role in the self-image of Hanoi and is often extolled in poetry and song. Another feature along the road into town is the 4-kilometer long ceramic wall. It commemorates the 1,000-year existence of Hanoi. As I said, the city was founded in the year 1010, and in 2010 they held the 1,000-year celebrations of the existence of the city. A young female journalist was awarded a prize for coming up with the idea to build this wall decorated with mosaic illustrations of monuments, buildings, traditions, and life in general in Vietnam. This is a view of the old city of Hanoi from the roof of our hotel. Note the small square buildings that rise almost like towers, and most of them seem to have rooftop gardens. In fact, we watch many people busy constructing new enclosures or gardens on their rooftops. A spectacular feature of the city is this freshwater lake right in the center of the busiest part of Hanoi. It's called the Lake of the Returned Sword. According to a legend, the Golden Turtle God gave a golden sword to the emperor to ward off the invading Chinese Ming dynasty troops. After the successful campaign, the emperor was sailing in a boat on the lake when a turtle rose up from the water, grabbed the sword, and disappeared back into the water. The sword was thus returned to the god. The turtle tower on the island in the lake was built in 1886 to commemorate this mystical history. There are, in fact, some large turtles in the lake. They're difficult to see, but possibly the largest freshwater turtles in the world seem to live here. The lake is a very popular area for festivals, but the citizens use it all the time, for walks in the evenings, over weekends, and we also spend some wonderful times walking around that lake and in the area, looking at what people are doing and how they amuse themselves or just to enjoy life. Adjacent to the lake is a building with a rooftop restaurant and coffee bar with a beautiful view over the lake and the surrounding areas. From there one can see the so-called Temple of the Jade Mountain, a Buddhist temple to commemorate a victory over invading Mongol forces. The so-called Bridge of the Rising Sun connects the shoreline to the island where the temple is situated. One of the most important must-see sights of Hanoi is the gigantic mausoleum of Ho Chi Minh, the father of the nation. Ho had a very interesting career. He received a French education at the Lycée in the Hue imperial capital. Between 1911 and 1917, he visited various countries. He worked on ships, at a hotel in New York, at General Motors in the United States, then moved to England and worked as a chef and dishwasher, and eventually as a waiter in France. Between 1919 and 1923, he became involved in politics with the French Socialist Party, and in 1923 he was employed by the Comintern in Russia. He returned to the Far East and in 1930 founded the Communist Party of Vietnam in Hong Kong. In 1941, he became the head of the so-called Viet Minh forces. Their purpose was to free Vietnam from French occupation. They suspended their campaign during the Second World War, but when the French reoccupied Vietnam after the Second World War, they actively launched their campaign, which resulted in the defeat of the French at Dien Bien Phu, as I mentioned earlier. He became President and Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam from 1955 until his death in 1969. The mausoleum is located in a beautiful park with a big lake in the middle. Also located in the park is the mansion of the former French governors that Ho Chi Minh refused to use. Instead, he held his cabinet meetings in a small house adjacent to the lake, and his very modest wooden house is also located in the park. During the 1990s, a large museum dedicated to the memory of Ho Chi Minh and the war period was constructed at one end of the park. There is a large statue of him in the entrance foyer. One of the displays is a mock-up of his house and some of his personal effects, illustrating his very simple lifestyle. I found a statement by Ho Chi Minh quite revealing of his dedication and purpose in life. My ultimate wish is that our entire party and people, closely joining their efforts, will build a peaceful, reunified, independent, democratic and prosperous Vietnam and make a worthy contribution to the world revolution. Once again, the emphasis on the reunification of his country. Yet another iconic, important historical site in Hanoi is the Central Prison, the euphemistically called Maison Centrale by the French and dubbed the Hanoi Hilton by the Americans who were imprisoned there during the war years. It was originally designed to hold 400 inmates, but eventually housed up to 2,000 people in squalid conditions. It was primarily used by the French for political prisoners, and it became a symbol of colonial suppression. It contains mock-ups of the way in which prisoners were chained to their benches and the grim reality of death row and the guillotine that was used during the French occupation. The first American inmate was Lieutenant Alvarez, who was shot down over Vietnam on the 5th of August 1964. The famous Senator John McCain was also imprisoned there for 5.5 years. Here he is looking at a picture of himself being saved from the water during a return visit to the Hanoi Hilton. One of the legacies that Confucius, the famous Chinese philosopher and reformer, bequeathed to the world was that he propagated good governance. And for that to happen, the bureaucrats had to be well trained and pass very strict exams. That tradition was replicated in Vietnam as well. The so-called Temple of Literature was constructed in 1070 already and is depicted on one of its banknotes. It became their university to train bureaucrats, royals, and mandarins. The interior has 5 courtyards where various ceremonies, study sessions, and strict exams took place. There's also a current tradition when students complete their academic studies, they come here for a final pass-out ceremony. This is an occasion for girls to wear their formal ao dai dresses. These traditional dresses consist of a tight-fitting silk tunic worn over silk pants. It developed during the imperial period in Wei, due to the influence of French fashion houses that were present in the colonial period. The ao dai emphasizes and symbolizes the connection between feminine beauty and Vietnamese nationalism, and is especially popular in, for instance, the pageants such as the Miss Ao Dai. It is worn during festivals and on special occasions, but there are also simpler versions available that can be seen on the streets. It feels as if I cannot stop talking about iconic features and traditions in Vietnam. And here is yet another, the Vietnamese water puppets, a tradition dating back to the 11th century. This tradition had its origin when stages were built in the flooded rice paddies. There were normally 8 to 10 operators that stand waist deep in the water and control the puppets from below the water. Exactly how the puppets were controlled was a closely guarded secret. In the early days, those poor operators had to endure mosquitoes and leeches. An orchestra and singers tell traditional tales related to the rural lifestyle, like fishing, planting of rice, and traditional folk tales. They also tell stories of soldiers and battles. But the artists are also responsible for placating the spirits to ensure that there is no trouble in the tribe. Here is a short extract from a performance in the Water Puppet Theatre in Hanoi. Part of the fascination of Hanoi is what happens on its streets, with its overcrowded shops and markets. I guess because the houses are generally small, everything seems to happen out in the streets in the open. The whole of a family's life seems to be clustered around these stores. There are different sections in the town. For instance, certain streets that specialize in jewelry or clothes and boutiques. In other areas, there is a mixture of stores with goods piled high way up to the ceiling. Here is an outdoor barber shop. At certain times of the day, particularly over weekends, some of the roads are closed. In a record time, the vendors would erect stalls, unpack their goods, and a street market is in full swing. Here is an example of a portable sidewalk braai, and certainly the food is very good. You can eat it directly in the street. And these mobile stores, with men and women wearing their traditional hats, sell a great variety of goods. The traffic of Hanoi is something that almost cannot be described. It has to be experienced. The streets are jam-packed with motorcycles and scooters that weave their way in and out skillfully, avoiding other traffic and all obstacles. Entire families are crowded onto some of these scooters. Parking is always at a premium, and how you find your little vehicle again is anybody's guess. I took this photograph of a street adjacent to the lake that I showed you earlier. You have to cross this road to get to the lake, and there's only one way to do it. You grip your wife's hand firmly and then you start walking steadily. You don't try and dodge the traffic, they dodge you. You don't slow down or go faster, but walk at a steady pace and you'll get across safely. Another way to move around Hanoi is in cyclos. It's almost like a bicycle rickshaw, and it's very convenient to weave through the traffic and see some of the further parts of the city. Before we leave Hanoi, let me say a final word about the traditional conical hat, the non la. It is regarded as a universal traditional symbol of the Vietnamese people, with no connotation of age, gender, tribe, or race. According to a legend, it is derived from the great woman in the sky, who protected the land from too much rain. She had a large hat that deflected the rain when necessary. The non la is woven from various available materials like palm leaves, bamboo, or the bark of mock trees. We will next visit the spectacular Halong Bay, which along with Cape Town was voted as one of the 7 geographical wonders of the world. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and covers an area of 1,500 square kilometers with almost 2,000 limestone islands, or karsts. The limestone was deposited over 500 million years ago, but the karsts have been eroded, creating large caves and fantastic shapes. According to a local legend, the country had to defend itself against an invading fleet. Dragons appeared from the heavens and spat out jewels that formed these islands. The islands protected the land and damaged the invading fleet. The dragons decided not to return to their origin and still live in the bay. We traveled to Haifang, the most important harbor city of Vietnam, another frequent target of American bombing during the war. We boarded a ship with overnight accommodation in the port and then sailed out in amongst the islands. Some of the islands have become quite well known, like this one, which is depicted on one of the country's bank notes. Here is another famous site. Just look and enjoy some of these spectacular sights. We stopped and visited some of the caves, and as you can imagine, the soft limestone has resulted in many spectacular stalactites and stalagmites with wonderful shapes. Our next stop is the famous Way, the imperial city that I have mentioned several times already. The city is situated on the banks of the so-called Perfume River. As the southern part of the country became more and more Vietnamese, the emperor apparently felt the need to move the capital closer to the central part of the country, and after consulting his geomancers, moved the capital here in the year 1802. The royal palace, known as the Purple Forbidden City, was built inside a citadel with an outer wall of 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers. The complex eventually consisted of 160 buildings. A new imperial lifestyle developed here, which impacted fashions, the arts and culture, as well as the bureaucracy that ruled the country, since both the central government as well as the academy where bureaucrats were trained were moved here. The imperial dynasty situated here ruled the country until 1945 at the end of the Second World War, when the French reoccupied the country. Visiting Way is unfortunately a bit of a sad experience. Those of you who remember some of the details of the war might recall that in January 1968, the Viet Cong launched the so-called Tet Offensive. It was a major offensive where thousands of troops were sent in to occupy many parts of Vietnam, including Hue. The US forces initially tried to avoid damaging the palace, but with mounting casualties in house-to-house combat, the order was given to bomb Hue. Only 10 buildings were left standing. Some of the buildings have been rebuilt, but it will take many years for the palace to be restored to its former glory. We enter the city through these royal gates. This is the throne room. This is the entrance to the domestic portion of the palace. And the next slide shows the entrance to the female section. As we move down the river from the palace, we arrive at the Celestial Lady Pagoda, dedicated to the goddess who advised the emperor to move his capital to Hue. I want to talk at this point about the end of the imperial period and what led to the division of Vietnam between its north and south. When the French reoccupied Vietnam after the end of the Second World War, the last emperor, called Bao Dai, abdicated. Bao Dai was the 13th emperor of the Hue imperial dynasty, and he renamed the country Vietnam. And he transferred what is known in Eastern traditions as the mandate from heaven to rule to Ho Chi Minh. This mandate is normally centered in the emperor of the country, but it gives the person the legitimacy to rule in the eyes of the people. In June 1945, however, the French persuaded Bao Dai to become the head of state of South Vietnam. He did this half-heartedly and actually spent most of his time overseas. In 1955, 1 year after the Viet Minh forces of Ho Chi Minh finally defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, Ngo Dien Diem deposed Bao Dai and became president of the new Republic of South Vietnam. And as I have indicated before, Ho Chi Minh was dedicated to freeing Vietnam from colonial control and to the reunification of his country, which inevitably led to the war between North and South. Certain Western countries, led by America, decided to support President Diem against the communist north of Ho Chi Minh and became trapped in this war because they did not recognize the essentially nationalistic nature of the conflict and were blinded by the ruling domino theory of the time, as I explained earlier. If ever you wish to gain an insight into this aspect of the conflict, I can highly recommend the book written by the New York Times correspondent David Halberstam called The Best and the Brightest. Interestingly, this war is known as the Vietnam War in America and the American War in Vietnam. I've already mentioned the Tet Festival, which is one of the most important festivals in Vietnam. It originated with farmers that need to get rid of all the pests before they can start planting their crops for the next season. The purpose of the festival is that animals and people must become stronger in both their health and their souls and overcome their own internal insects. The whole family must get up early and eat fermented, sticky dumplings and fruit. It is believed that lye water dumplings will cleanse one's body of any unwanted parasites. The worshipping is held at noon, the hour of Ngo. The traditional food is sticky rice cakes shaped like a pyramid, wrapped in banana leaves, stuffed with beans and banana essence, and little balls of fermented rice bathed in wine. The Tet Festival leads me on to agriculture, which is a major component of the Vietnamese economy. Vietnam is the fourth largest exporter of rice in the world, and as we drive down the countryside, we see these fertile valleys that are intensely farmed. Interesting too that graves are located in the fields which are being cultivated. This is apparently to honor the ancestors and to have them close to the areas in which they work. Aquaculture has become a major industry in the country and has grown at least 20% per annum since the year 2010. With such a long coastline, the development of coastal resorts to stimulate the tourist industry has been another major contributing factor to the economy. Just south of Hue, we drove up the 21-kilometer Haifang Pass, meaning Ocean Cloud Pass, which traverses a mountain range that dips into the East Sea of Vietnam and historically formed the physical barrier between the founding Dai Viet area and the rest of the coastal areas. From the top where there is an old fort, we can look down across the bay with its beautiful beaches next to the city of Da Nang. Many US soldiers were sent to Da Nang for R&R, rest and recreation, and the beach of Da Nang became very famous because a movie was made called China Beach, so the beach also became known as China Beach. We also stopped for some R&R and had a wonderful lunch on the beach. Da Nang used to be the headquarters of the US Air Force in Vietnam. The significance of this air base will become apparent soon as we talk more about the bombing during the war years. We now move further to another fascinating and beautiful town called Hoi An, the City of Lanterns. It is another UNESCO World Heritage Site dating from the 15th century. It became quite cosmopolitan because Chinese, Japanese, Indian, and Portuguese traders settled there. The city was subdivided into ethnic and language groups, and those subdivisions with their own cultural character exist to this day. During the imperial era in Hue, it became the most important trade center in the South China Sea. Today it is largely a tourist city with traditional arts, culture, architecture and crafts, such as ceramics and textiles. This mix of cultures becomes quite apparent when you walk down the street and you see the different wooden Chinese shophouses, colorful French colonial buildings, ornate Vietnamese tube houses, and even the iconic Japanese covered bridge with its pagoda. This is a picture of the most sacred temple of Hoi An, and dedicated to an esteemed Chinese general who is worshipped as a symbol of loyalty, sincerity, integrity, and justice. It was felt that these values are essential for a successful business environment and a trading town. Note the interesting incense burners shaped like pyramids. This is probably an appropriate time to introduce the 4 sacred animals of Vietnam. First of all, the dragon. The dragon is a symbol of the emperor. It consists of the head of a camel, horns of a deer, eyes of a fish, ears of a buffalo, the body and neck of a snake, scales of a crab, claws of an eagle, and the feet of a tiger. The next is the unicorn. It is a symbol of intelligence and virtue. It consists of the head of a dragon, the body of an antelope, feet of a horse, and the tail of a buffalo. Next is the tortoise or the turtle. That is the symbol of heaven and earth. It is sometimes depicted with the head of a dragon or a small tortoise on its back with coins. It is also depicted with a crane on its back, a coral branch in its beak, and on top of the holy book of luck too. This is the book that describes the separation of heaven and earth into its male and female parts. And finally there's the phoenix. It contains the beak of a duck, the neck of a snake, the back of a tortoise, and the tail of a fish. Its song contains the 5 fundamental sounds of music. In other words, the pentatonic scale, which forms the basis of all traditional Eastern music. The feathers display the 5 fundamental colors of black, white, red, blue, and yellow. Its body contains the 6 celestial bodies. The head is the sky, the eyes are the sun, the back is the moon, the wings are the wind, its feet the earth, and the tail the planets. The phoenix rises from the ashes of destruction when there is peace in times of conflict. It is therefore the symbol of peace and unity. These symbols can always be seen in the decorations of temples in various configurations. It was fascinating to learn how many elements of their mythology and traditions are encapsulated in these four symbols. This being a town of culture, they offer performances of traditional music and dances. These tell stories about the traditional way of life and includes household chores, a joker, and somebody to ward off evil spirits. Of course, the real magic of the city lies in ambling through the streets and looking at what their shops have on offer. If you are interested in a dress or a suit, then pop into one of their many boutiques. There you can choose the material that you prefer. They will take your measurements, and the suit or dress will be manufactured overnight and delivered to your hotel the next morning. This photograph of a tailor shop was taken close to midnight when they were busily working at the orders of the day. But the main attraction is really the lanterns. Thousands of lanterns displayed in the streets and in all the stores. And when the sun sets, these are all lit, and the whole town changes into a magical wonderland. And so we move from beautiful and peaceful Hoi An to the big city of the south, Ho Chi Minh City, the former Saigon, the former capital of the Republic of South Vietnam, the center of so much culture but also so much history and conflict. It is a beautiful city, with its tall buildings, with its canals and boulevards. In fact, it was known as the Paris of the East. Our hotel was situated next to the beautiful Central Boulevard, where you can go for wonderful walks and even do your daily exercise. But, of course, traffic remains a challenge, and parking even a bigger headache for the local citizens. There is a collection of beautiful French colonial-style buildings, of which this Notre Dame Cathedral is probably the most important. As I indicated in one of my opening slides, about 8% of the population consider themselves Christians. They are virtually all Catholics and are centered in the southern part of the country. In October 2005, a witness claimed to have seen a tear streaking down from the right side of the Virgin Mary statue. Thousands of local Vietnamese Catholics swarmed into the city to catch a glimpse of the alleged miracle. The area was clogged for days, stopping all traffic, and the statue was the center of a candlelight shrine at night time. It didn't take long for photoshopped versions of the Virgin Mary, replete with tear and halo, to appear on the streets and sold at exorbitant prices to gullible worshippers and tourists. The church finally stepped in. The local priest declared that there was a coincidental combination of dust and rain that happened to form in the shape of a tear. Followers did not readily accept this explanation, and hundreds of tourists still visit the Virgin Mary statue on a daily basis, hoping to catch another view of the miracle. Across the street from the cathedral is another iconic French-style building, the Central Post Office, with its majestic arched roof, a mosaic of Ho Chi Minh, and a series of old telephone booths. This is the central market, with rows and rows of goods piled to the roof. We are going to look now at some of the monuments, buildings, and consequences of the war, and maybe wise at this stage for a quick overview of the conduct of the war. During the 1960 presidential campaign in the United States, the Republican Party blamed the Democratic Party for losing China under a Democratic President Truman to communism. Thus, when Kennedy became president in 1961, one of his major foreign policy concerns was to prevent the rest of Southeast Asia becoming communist. His government therefore decided to support President Ngo Dinh Diem to forestall other countries in Southeast Asia from becoming communist. Active U.S. military intervention in Vietnam commenced under President Kennedy, but was massively increased under President Johnson from 1964 onwards. President Diem was a Catholic and made his regime very unpopular by forcing some of his minority views on the majority of the population. Diem appointed his brother Ngo Dien Nhu as a special advisor, who became a very powerful figure with control over all the security forces. Since Diem was not married, his brother's wife, Madame Nhu, became the de facto First Lady. She was a kind of Eva Peron personality and much hated in the country. His unpopular regime elicited increasing number of mass demonstrations, especially after a Buddhist monk who drove down from Hue in a blue car set himself alight at the busy cross-section in Saigon. Because the Americans were concerned about the commitment of the military leadership to continue with the war under such an unpopular regime, the CIA agreed to a plot to remove Diem from power. Diem and his brother were murdered on the 2nd of November 1963 in a church. Coincidentally, President Kennedy was murdered 20 days later in Dallas. Despite the efforts of the Americans, South Vietnam was never able to establish a stable, democratically elected government. There were 11 different heads of state between the regime of Diem and 1975, when the country finally fell to the invading forces from the north. This is a picture of the presidential palace. At the end of the war, when the communist government took over, they decided that they would not rule from this elaborate palace, but would turn it into a museum. It is now called the Reunification Hall. It is, however, used periodically for official functions. We will now look at some pictures of the interior of the building. This is a getaway helicopter that was always at the ready to remove the president to safety should the need arise. On the 30th of April 1975, Saigon fell to the invading North Vietnamese forces. This is a picture of the first tank that smashed through the main gate of the palace enclosure. This tank and the second one are now displayed as monuments in the palace compound. This photograph is a picture of a building which is not far from the palace. It used to be the CIA headquarters at the time of the conflict. This is an iconic news photograph that was taken of the last helicopter to depart Saigon. As you can see, it's dated the day before the tank smashed into the palace building. There's a queue of Vietnamese who used to work for the Americans that are desperately trying to flee before the invading forces take over the city. This is a monument to commemorate the life of the Buddhist monk who set himself alight, which sparked the demonstrations against the regime of President Diem. This is a picture of the church where Diem and his brother were murdered. There was a 4-kilometer long secret underground tunnel connecting the church to the palace, which was to be used as a safe getaway. However, they were betrayed, and when they came to the church, they were murdered. There is a small plaque on one of the benches indicating the place where they were killed. This is a picture of their bodies in the back of a military truck. The War Remnants Museum in Saigon contains many graphic displays of some of the events and consequences of the war. In the garden, there is a display of some of the captured American military hardware. Virtually the whole second floor of the building contains pictures and explanatory details of events and incidents of the war. Most of these photos were donated to the museum by the journalists who photographed them originally. This very famous picture was taken by a Vietnamese journalist of a 9-year-old girl fleeing from a village that had been napalmed by the American forces. It was voted as one of the 100 most influential photographs of the 20th century. The girl, who has been nicknamed the Napalm Girl, in later life studied in Cuba and then escaped to Canada, where she was given asylum. She now runs a foundation with the aim of providing medical and psychological assistance to child victims of war. This suspected Viet Cong operative was executed by a South Vietnamese soldier in one of the streets in Saigon. One of the features of the war was the intense bombing campaigns that the American Air Force conducted. This is a statement by General Curtis LeMay, commander of the Strategic Air Command of the U.S. Air Force. My solution to the problem would be to tell them, the North Vietnamese, frankly that they've got to draw in their horns, or we are going to bomb them back into the Stone Age. This busy poster shows the infrastructure damage that the country sustained due to all the bombing raids. It's a busy slide and I'm not going to go through all of it, but it shows items such as 100% of all power plants destroyed, 1,500 out of 1,600 irrigation works destroyed, bridges, churches, hospitals, schools, and tens of thousands of hectares of land devastated. There are also photographs with some pride showing the areas that were destroyed by the bombing runs and have since been restored. As terrible as so many aspects of any war is, one particularly gruesome aspect of this war, to my mind, is the consequences of the use of defoliants. Vast amounts of certain chemicals, particularly Agent Orange, which contains a chemical called dioxin, was sprayed on the forests of the country in order to remove the foliage so that the movement of enemy forces could be detected. It only became apparent later that these chemicals cause severe deformities in unborn children. There are today thousands of children have to be cared for permanently in institutions. America has made financial contributions to some of the institutions trying to care for these people, but they've never formally admitted any liability for the after effects of these chemicals. The problem is exacerbated by the fact that much of the groundwater in many areas of the country is contaminated with these chemicals. It is quite a shock when you are confronted by these unfortunate people begging on the streets or even in a restaurant, as has happened to us. I need to explain the origin of the term Viet Cong. Many of the Vietnamese soldiers involved in the war were recruited in the south, taken to the north for training, and then infiltrated back to the south via the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran through Laos and Cambodia. The Western media called these soldiers the Viet Cong, which is short for Viet Nam Cong San, meaning Vietnamese communists. They consisted of army units, guerrilla fighters, and cadres that infiltrated into every village. The local population therefore found themselves caught between two sides in this conflict. The largest Viet Cong operation was the Tet Offensive, launched during the Tet festivities of 1968, when 100 towns and villages were attacked simultaneously. I talked about that earlier when I described the disastrous consequences for the imperial city of Hue. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, used to infiltrate the soldiers back into the south, was regularly subjected to intense bombing campaigns. This is an article taken from the National Geographic. The US dropped more than 2 million tons of bombs on Laos from 1964 to 1973 during the Vietnam War. That is equal to a plane load every 8 minutes for 9 years. To protect themselves against these bombing raids, the Viet Cong dug an extensive network of underground tunnels where they lived and used as infiltration routes into the various parts of the country. Such an underground warren of tunnels and living quarters has been preserved below the town of Cu Chi, just outside Saigon, and turned into an outdoor museum. This is a schematic diagram of the 250-kilometer long tunnel network below the town. And the next one is a cross-section of the living quarters with the connecting tunnels, showing an entrance on the banks of a nearby river. There were even weapons factories, weapons magazines, and field hospitals below ground. Access points, ventilation shafts, and even chimneys are carefully camouflaged and hidden in the forest above. We were shown this tunnel entrance and the exit point apparently some 20 or 30 meters further down. I decided that I must try this, so I let myself down into this narrow little hole and started crawling flat on my stomach along this pitch-black tunnel, which is just above my head. I am a much bigger person than most Vietnamese. My body barely fitted into this narrow tunnel. I crawled and crawled and crawled, but could not find the exit. At one point I felt things like bats flying over my head, and the tunnel became shallower. Then I got to a dead-end point, with tunnels leading off in different directions. I thought I'm going to get completely lost underground. My only way out would be to crawl backwards and hope to find that entrance again. So backwards I went until I finally saw the light and could just squeeze my hands up into this hole. I could not lift myself out of the entrance, and fortunately some of the other tourists who were waiting for me at the so-called exit came over to pull me out. It was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, and even to this day when I think of this experience, I almost break out in a cold sweat. The Australians, who were allies of the United States in this war, were the first to decide to attack the Viet Cong in the tunnels. They sent soldiers up the tunnels to attack them in their living quarters below ground. They were called tunnel rats. As a defense measure, the Viet Cong laid booby traps for them by placing spikes in the ground hidden by a flimsy top covering. When an attacking soldier reached one of these hidden booby traps, the top would collapse and they would be impaled on the spikes. And now enough of the war stories. We will end this journey by a visit to the fertile and economically important Mekong Delta. This 4,300-kilometer long river rises in the Tibetan Plateau of China, runs through 6 countries, and discharges into the South China Sea in Vietnam. The Mekong Delta is farmed intensely and has very little natural vegetation left. The river is, of course, a major transportation corridor, featuring all manner of ships, boats, and ferries. We boarded a boat, sailed up the river, passing all kinds of traffic along the way, and visited various islands. At one of them, we boarded canoes and were rowed by local women through the thick palm groves of the area. It was interesting to see that they used the hyacinth, which grows abundantly in some of these canals, as material to weave baskets, sandals, and other products. We ended our tour at a large outdoor restaurant. This is an opportunity to explain the menus and the kind of food one would generally encounter in a restaurant in Vietnam. This is a typical menu that generally offers at least 6 to 8 courses. Soup is standard fare on any menu. We often had fish or pork as main course, and in this case we had a special treat of dragonfish. To eat it, you break off a piece of the fish, remove the scales, wrap it in a thin rice pancake together with sticks of cucumber and lettuce, dip it in a sweet and sour sauce, and then eat it with rice which is served separately in a bowl. And what does it taste like? Well, it tastes like fish. Virtually every meal we had ended with fruit, including some exotic items such as dragon fruit. One thing is sure, we loved the food in Vietnam. On our way out, our final treat consisted of cool coconut water. And so we come to the end of this glorious journey through this amazing country. Thank you for traveling with us.